Again, the US has hit its debt ceiling. That's triggered a battle in Congress. Republicans say spending must be cut to lift the borrowing cap. But President Biden insists there should be no preconditions. So what happens next? And what effect does all this have on the global economy? This is Inside Story. Hello there and welcome to the programme. I'm Laura Kyle. The White House has sought to assure Americans that Congress will find a bipartisan solution to avoid a debt default. That's after the country hit a $31.4 trillion borrowing limit on Thursday last week. Congress usually votes and agrees to raise that limit, as it did the last time in 2021. But the standoff in Washington this time seems significantly riskier. Some Republicans have declared they won't raise the borrowing ceiling again unless President Joe Biden agrees to steep cuts in federal spending. But Democrats aren't budging. That's raised fears of a political showdown that could unsettle markets and hit global growth.
I also want to talk about the extreme Republican economic plans. Apparently they're generally serious about cutting Social Security, cutting Medicare, and I love their 30% sales tax. We want to talk a lot about that. But look, I have no intention of letting the Republicans wreck our economy, nor does anybody around this table, in my view.
Well, let's take a closer look at what's next for the US. Reaching the debt ceiling means the government isn't allowed to borrow any more money unless Congress agrees. The federal government could run out of money to pay its bills as soon as June. That would pressure Congress to either raise or suspend the federal borrowing limit. If that doesn't happen, some agencies will be forced to shut down or scale back their work. That's happened 3 times in the past 10 years. But even delays come with a cost. The dollar would weaken and borrowing costs rise in the form of higher interest rates for mortgages, credit card debt and other loans. However, America's debt to GDP, that's the gross domestic product ratio, sits at 128%, and that's lower than more than a dozen other countries, including Japan, Greece and Italy. Well, for more on this, let's bring in our guests. And in California, William Lee, Chief Economist at the Milken Institute. In Washington, D.C., Laura Blessing, Senior Fellow at the Government Affairs Institute at Georgetown University. And in Seoul, June Park, Schmidt Futures Asia Fellow at the International Strategy Forum. A very warm welcome to all of you. William, first of all, tell us how the US managed to amass this extraordinary amount of debt, $31.4 trillion. It's more than most of us can even imagine.
It's a phenomenal number. And when you think in terms of trillions of dollars, it's really hard to wrap your head around it. One of the things that you have to remember is that governments finance themselves either through taxes and or by borrowing. And what has happened is that the huge level of government expenditures, whether it's for welfare programs or for defense or just for government administration, has resulted in larger and larger governments over time. And these larger governments have had to fund themselves, and they've not always raised taxes to balance the budget. And once you have a deficit, there's only one way to finance it, and that is through borrowing. And so the U.S. deficits have accumulated over many decades and centuries, going back to the revolutionary days. And so we now have a position where the U.S. has borrowed an enormous amount of money from its own people, but now about 1/3 of the debt has been borrowed from the rest of the world. And what sets the U.S. apart from the rest of the world borrowing is that the U.S. has reserve currency. In other words, countries are willing to lend to the U.S. if they're paid back in U.S. dollars. And that gives a U.S. a special privilege, which in some sense has allowed the U.S. to run a much larger deficit and much larger levels of debt outstanding than other countries.
OK. June, the whole world is in more debt than ever before. Give us an idea as how the US ranks when you look at the situation as a whole.
Well, because the Federal Reserve Board has been going on with the interest hikes, the rest of the world, coupled with the impacts from the Russian invasion of Ukraine, is seeing a rise in prices generally. And in the case of South Korea, the Bank of Korea keeps on raising interest rates following the Federal Reserve Board's designation of new interest rates. So in general, a lot of countries, especially in the industrialized world, people are grappling with having to pay their bills and having to pay for their loans, and everything that has to do with a borrowing scheme has a burden on these people. And going further, because the U.S. is the Fed is intended to raise further the interest rate, we're going to see a huge burden on these people around the globe.
I think it's generally assumed, isn't it, Laura, that debt is not a good thing. But how much debt is too much debt?
We debt is a economic concept, but it's also a political one too. And we've created structural deficits from a series of different government policies. I mean, the United States economy has actually been government spending has been roughly about the same percentage of U.S. GDP for, multiple generations at this point. The policy decisions to cut taxes in particular have caused a lot of structural deficits, but you have spending that have been priorities by both parties that has created this current state of affairs. Economists certainly have different levels of debt that they find to be concerning, and I think everyone would consider the United States debt right now to certainly be in that category.
So, William, if the percentage of debt to GDP in the US hasn't changed that much over the generations, why does the US bother having a debt ceiling?
Yeah, the levels of spending and taxation relative to GDP have been roughly the same, but unfortunately, spending has always exceeded the level of revenues and taxes. And so what you find in the case of the United States is that you are finding it difficult to finance more and more of this debt because the rest of the world and U.S. citizens in general are less willing to hold on to this debt because of concerns about not getting paid off. Now, as I said earlier, by definition, the U.S. is able to pay off its debts with U.S. dollars. And by printing more U.S. dollars, we can always pay off the debt. Unfortunately, one consequence of doing that would be higher and higher inflation, which is a consequence that no government is willing to accept. So one of the things that we have to consider in managing the levels of U.S. debt would be what is sustainable. And at the IMF, where I used to work, there are formulas that are used to calculate sustainable levels of debt. And with low interest rates as they are now, even though they're rising, they're still low enough that the U.S. levels of debt are more than sustainable. We are able to pay our interest payments in a fairly easy fashion. And so the question really comes down to the point of politics. What government is willing to cut back on expenditures in order to limit the amount of debt that's issued? And right now, the Republicans are asking Democrats, you've got to cut back on entitlements, that is spending that is made permanent by legislation. And the Democrats are saying no, because our people need these entitlements, cut back on something else, cut back on defense. And so the debate in Congress is going back and forth about where to cut. And the debt ceiling has been used as a hostage for these discussions in order to get one side to move on or the other side to move.
So, Laura, we've had Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen implement some extraordinary measures to tide the US over until, she says, about June. So, as William says, the focus now is on Congress, isn't it, to sort out this issue for a longer term. And you've got this knot of hardcore Republicans suddenly in the House of Representatives on the one side, and you've got a very stubborn-sounding Joe Biden leading the Democrats on the other. So who's gonna give in? What's going to happen here?
It's an excellent question, and we've seen has become a particularly familiar dance that I think we've become a little bit too inured to. But we've been having kind of partisan fights concerning the debt ceiling, where a majority of one party is lining up against the other since 1953. I really want to underscore that this is there's no kind of good era for the debt ceiling. It's also not designed to result in fiscal restraint. It was actually designed to give the Treasury more flexibility when it's originally created in 1917. And we're also perfectly capable of raising it without having any effect on government taxing or spending. Of course, it's being used as a tool to try to bring people to the table in terms of having some larger bargain. Obama and Speaker Boehner famously attempted and failed at a grand bargain to rein in federal spending, but there's no requirement that you actually do any legislating around spending and taxing. And I want to put taxing on the table too, not just spending cuts. Because it's a math problem. You can add and subtract, but this is not a circumstance that is particularly fortuitous for, calm, measured, expert policymaking when you engage in this level of brinksmanship. And in fact, it's never been used successfully as a tool for fiscal restraint.
And in the meantime, June, the rest of the world watches and holds its breath. I mean, what do other countries think of the US when it watches this brinkmanship play out in the 11th hour?
So regarding the treasury bonds that are issued in order to secure government expenditure and budget, many of the foreign countries that hold US treasury bills, they've been scaling back, especially Japan and China in the past months have been scaling back the amount of their T-bill purchases. And it also has to do with the fact that the Fed has been increasing its interest rate, because the overall impact that the US economy has onto other countries is very much correlated, associated with the amounts of the liabilities that the US has onto these countries. And it could be the case that into the coming months, they could scale back even further. And we won't know until June how the Congress would react in response to the debt ceiling. But chances are there would be very, very harsh criticisms from China regarding the US fiscal discipline.
William, Japan, China, they hold most of the US's treasury bonds, don't they? They're generally seen across the world as robust, as you mentioned earlier. But what if that's not so much the case now? What impact does that have?
Well, let's remember why it is that other countries hold U.S. treasuries and U.S. debt securities in general. It's because they've been running current account trade surpluses with the United States. In other words, they've exported more to us than they've imported from us. And this imbalance has resulted in accepting U.S. dollars as payment for their exports. And in order to invest these dollars to earn some interest, they have bought U.S. treasuries because of all financial assets that are denominated in U.S. dollars, it is the most safe, it is the most secure because of the U.S. creditworthiness, the belief that the U.S. will always pay its debt obligations, whether it's interest payments or rolling over the debt. But the debt ceiling puts that in question. And I think one of the things to remember also is that the U.S. Treasury security is the foundation of pricing for all other securities in the world. So the consequences for the rest of the world goes beyond the amount of debt that's held by Japan or UK or China. It really is at the basis of all financial instrument pricing. In other words, everything that's issued, whether it's by emerging market countries or by the euro area, every security is priced based upon the price that's of credit worthiness of U.S. Treasuries. So that's a very important thing to keep in mind, is that the discussions about possibility of not paying U.S. interest is something that will shake the global financial markets to its very core, because its very core is based upon pricing of U.S. Treasuries. And so that is the ramification that Secretary Yellen and every Federal Reserve chairman wants to avoid, which is to shake the financial system of the global economy.
Nearly all the financial assets on the planet, they're priced in relation, aren't they, to US Treasury bonds. So if the US does default, what would happen? The entire financial world becomes riskier?
Well, as we have seen in the case of the 2011 debt ceiling crisis, I think there is a possibility for a last minute cap increase, or there could be some other avenues or policy action by the US government that we don't know yet. It's not something that we can anticipate at this moment because it will be played out until June.
But let's look ahead and
clear-
hypothetically say that that doesn't happen.
The debt ceiling does not increase.
Do you agree with that, Laura? Do you agree that that scenario simply cannot exist?
It would be catastrophic. It would be absolutely economically catastrophic to the United States as well as to the rest of the world. And historically, what has happened is the threat of that catastrophe has prompted action, even if albeit last minute action, in episodes such as 2011, where what had previously been a partisan but not perilous pattern of raising the debt ceiling, all of a sudden it became genuinely dangerous. Historically, the pattern is that these folks play with fire, but come together at the last minute. And we are shaping up to have potentially our most dangerous episode yet, just given the coordination challenges in Congress. We have a lot of coordination difficulties in the House of Representatives, which the world has seen play out with the speakership votes, rather, I should say. While the House is the more worrisome chamber, it's also going to be difficult in the Senate. They've got 51 senators. Unless you attach this to a reconciliation package, which won't happen, this is something that you're going to need 60 senators to vote for. In December of 2021, they had this historically highly unusual episode where they had a filibuster carve out. So they created a mechanism by which they could raise the debt ceiling without having a single Republican senator vote for it. So the House will be particularly difficult, but the Senate is not going to be a cakewalk either. We should genuinely be concerned, even though historically this has been raised. But the world and the press is right to be paying a lot of attention to this. This is an important issue to educate people about.
But the thing that I'm struggling to get my head around, William, is that it doesn't have to be this way. It could quite simply not have a debt ceiling. I mean, Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen has said that she would support getting rid of that ceiling, but President Biden has said he is against it. Can you explain to us why people want to keep it?
Well, let's remember, when you ask the question, what would have happened if the U.S. did not raise the debt ceiling? Well, it happened in 2011. And what happened was stock markets crashed around the world. All asset prices, the value of these financial assets started to crash because the basis of its pricing on U.S. Treasuries was put in doubt. So that's the financial disaster that the world wants to avoid. The U.S. had a AAA rating status on its securities, and it became AA by Standard & Poor's. So the U.S. really paid a huge price for that kind of recalcitrance in not raising the debt ceiling. Now, why is it that every politician wants to keep that around? Why don't we just raise the debt ceiling to be 5 times the level of debt that we have now to give it more room, the way they do in Denmark? But the reason why is because every minority party, and Democrats, Republicans together, both realize they will be the minority at some point. It gives the minority party in the United States leverage to get its political agenda across and pass legislation. Unfortunately, it puts the rest of the world at hostage to these domestic political battles. And so the political science of the debt ceiling is really what drives the discussion and the dynamics. No party will ever get rid of the U.S. debt ceiling because it knows that if it's ever in the minority, it can hold up everything and sort of put pressure on the majority to get some of its political agenda passed. So that history is something that has plagued the U.S. debt ceiling. Whereas you have other debt ceilings in, say, the euro area. 60% of GDP was the mandate from Maastricht, the Maastricht Treaty that put together the euro area and allowed the euro to be the common currency for all these European countries. Well, that 60% debt ceiling has consequences because the euro itself is based on having no more debt than 60%. So when Italy and Greece starts to exceed these limits, other countries pull together and force discipline onto Italy or Greece or whatever country is exceeding its share of the debt ceiling. United States, there is no such limit that is placed on Congress. It's the two parties debating, and because there's no forceful limit that can be placed on U.S. Congress, no political party will ever allow the debt ceiling discussion to go away.
Laura, do you agree with that? Do you agree that this perennial battle is here to stay?
I agree that I cannot foresee a circumstance in the near future where, let's be frank, the Democratic Party would have the votes to abolish the debt ceiling. And while you have had certainly both parties using it as a partisan tool to show that they would prefer to do spending a different way or do fiscal politics a different way, from the other party, you have had serious voices, including of major party leaders in the Democratic Party recently, be in favor of abolishing it or at least reforming it in a major way. So I testified to Congress last February, and you had a number of different bills that had been put forward to either abolish it or to kind of blunt it as a dangerous tool. While it has been used by both parties over time, I wouldn't describe it as being kind of akin to the filibuster as something that you always want when you're, in the minority or when you're trying to point out that you have a difference of opinion from whoever's in charge. I do think that there was a missed opportunity for Biden last fall to use the bully pulpit of the presidency to push harder for a potential abolition of the debt ceiling, or at least some level of reform. I mean, let's be clear. There are a lot of different ways that we could reform this to be less dangerous than it is right now. I would personally favor what Secretary Yellen does, which is to get rid of it entirely. But we could. There are lots of different ways of blunting it. To be fair to Biden, Senator Manchin would. I'm not sure that the votes in the Senate were there, but if ever there were an issue to kind of more stridently campaign on and try to push for, this would have been this would have been an issue I would have gone to the mats for last fall when they had more Democratic votes to make the attempt.
I can see William is still very adamant that there will never ever be a change to this debt ceiling. But I just want to bring June in lastly because
I don't foresee them having the votes.
Right.
Anytime.
June, the US is not an island. It may be the superpower of the world, but it certainly is influenced by the rest of the world. Is there no pressure that can come from outside the US to force a change, to force some reform, given that its actions does hold the rest of the global financial system to hostage?
If the US does not come to a plausible conclusion in resolving this question, I think the consequences could be quite disastrous, especially for the countries that are holding the US Treasury bills. Chances are it's not going to be the case that the Treasury bonds are secure for investors. And that might impact countries' decisions to keep on buying. And the willingness to buy is the key issue here because previously there has been an assured kind of insurance by buying the Treasury bills for these countries. But the scaling back efforts by China and Japan in recent months gives me the sense that depending on the geopolitical situation or geopolitical risk per se, there are chances that countries would not be willing to hold them if they do not desire them. And that would be a very, very consequential situation for the United States.
Okay, well, we're going to have to leave it there. It has been a great discussion, and there's some key dates that we'll definitely be watching out for in the coming months in this ongoing debacle, I think we should call it, in the US. William Lee, Laura Blessing, and June Park, thank you very much for joining us. And thank you too for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, that's aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, do go to our Facebook page, that's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Laura Kyle, and the whole team here, it's bye for now.